when Marnie was writing Permission to Roar, she talked about this rabbi. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he was. She had no way to find him. And then about, I don't know, after the book came out, a couple months later, we happened to be looking at some comparable titles for another author we work with. And she said, oh my God, that's the rabbi. That's the book, More Beautiful Than Before. I think that's the rabbi. And that's how we found him. She reached out to him, and now he's going to be here today in just a couple seconds. In fact, Marnie, will you introduce him?
I would love to. So this is the first time I'm seeing you, Rabbi, since I was 16. And want to personally thank you for being that shift in my life, for having, you were such a young man right out of a rabbinical school, and you had such presence to give me that little nugget that changed everything. So I'm so honored to introduce Rabbi Steve Leder. He's currently serves as the senior rabbi of Wilshire Boulevard Temple, a synagogue in LA with 2 campuses with 2,400 families. In addition to his many duties at the temple, Rabbi Leder is a regular contributor and guest on the Today Show. He writes regularly for Time, FoxNews.com, and Maria Shriver's Sunday paper. His first book, The Extraordinary Nature of Ordinary Things, is amazing. William Safire called it uplifting. His second book, More Money Than God, Living a Rich Life Without Losing Your Soul, received critical media attention, including articles in the New York Times, NPR, CBS. And the book that we all read that's so important for our time that really just blew me away is More Beautiful Than Before, How Suffering Transforms Us, quickly reached number 4 on Amazon's overall bestseller list in the first week. I have been handing this book out like water. It's been helping people, tens of thousands of people who are suffering from emotional, physical pain during what we're going through right now. He's now at work at his next book, The Beauty of What Remains, What Death Teaches Us About Life, to be published in 2021. He's twice named one of the 10 most influential rabbis in America. And we are so delighted to honor the rabbi. I don't know, hopefully you received the award. We have to give it to you virtually. But all of us at the San Diego Writers Festival are honored to present you with the Nonfiction Author of the Year award. Thank you for changing my life and hundreds of thousands of lives with your words. I think he's going to go grab the award. This is very full circle. Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you so much. And with that, I will give it away to Dean. I think, Jennifer, are you going to introduce Dean? Because Dean is also phenomenal.
Hi there. Hello. I wanted to go off screen so you could all be bigger on the screen. And yes, that was awesome. I'm so glad I got to witness that. Thank you. Thank you, Marnie. Thank you, Rabbi Leder. Now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Dean Nelson, who will be interviewing Rabbi Leder. And by the way, all of you Facebook audience, if you have questions for Rabbi Leder, put them in the comment section below. We'll have time for Q&A after the interview. Dr. Dean Nelson is the founder and director of the journalism program at Point Loma Nazarene University here in San Diego. He writes occasionally for the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and San Diego Magazine. He has traveled throughout the world covering stories of human interest, to name just a few: India, where he wrote about the slums of Bombay; Kosovo, where he interviewed and wrote about victims of terrorism; Tanzania, where he wrote about members of the Black Panther Party who live in exile; Tibet, he wrote about religious persecution. He has won several awards for a reason, I'll tell you, from the Society of Professional Journalists for his reporting, and has written or co-written 14 books, including his 2019 book with HarperCollins, Talk to Me: How to Ask Better Questions, Get Better Answers, and Interview Anyone Like a Pro, which, by the way, I use and highly recommend. In addition to directing the PLNU journalism program, Nelson also supports the annual Writers' Symposium by the Sea, where prominent writers come to discuss the craft of writing. These wildly popular interviews have included Anne Lamott, Amy Tan, Joyce Carol Oates, Bill Moyers, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and Deepak Chopra. Dean, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hey, thanks. It's an honor to be here and hang out with Jennifer and Anastasia and Marnie again. But oh my gosh, Rabbi Leder, what a thrill to talk to you finally, sort of screen to screen. I mean,
Yeah,
we had a delightful phone conversation a little while ago, and not until after that conversation did I realize, come on, we're both from Minnesota. Of course we got along.
Where did you grow up in Minnesota, Dean?
South Minneapolis, not far before George Floyd was killed.
So my dad's business was at 3240 Snelling.
Oh my gosh. So maybe we'll just forget about writing.
Forget that, right.
Days of Minnesota lore.
I had breakfast with my dad at the Town Talk Diner every Saturday of my childhood.
I love it.
Yeah.
Well, I think was it St. Louis Park? Is that where you grew up?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So I went to school in Hopkins at Blake School, and so not far from you. So, okay, maybe we'll talk about writing.
Okay.
So, Rabbi Leder, you wrote a book that addresses pain, suffering, and dying. Why would anyone want to read a book about that?
Or write a book about that.
Or write, well, yeah, good point.
Look, this book was an apology. And let me explain what I mean by that. I had been a rabbi for 27 years before I wrote this book. This book, More Beautiful Than Before, is my third. And I, like all rabbis, like all clergy, I had seen and been a part of the pain of many, many individuals and families through those first 27 years. All kinds of pain. And we all know that pain comes in many forms, but there are certain common denominators to pain. They're almost always about some form of loss, for example. And they're almost always humbling. So there's certain common denominators, but pain comes in many varieties. And I had experienced a lot of vicarious pain as a rabbi and tried to help people as best I could and say things that I thought were actually meaningful. And then something terribly painful happened to me. I was in a very frightening car accident, and to make a long story short, it resulted in tremendous physical pain, opioids, steroids, then spinal surgery, then more opioids and steroids, clinical depression. And it was a long road back for me, and I had some very dark moments. And it was during that period that I realized, despite my best efforts during those previous 27 years, I actually knew little to nothing at all about pain. And I wrote this book as a form of an apology to my congregation, really. Although it doesn't read that way, I'm giving you sort of the subterranean understanding of where it comes from. I wanted to set the record straight on where I had been wrong. You know, there are some places where I had been right that were worth repeating, but mostly the book is about where I was wrong and my attempt to try and repair that thinking, and to give people something that was much more rooted in the real and the existential experience of pain. So that's why I wrote it. And now there are other whys. Why would anyone want to read a book about this? Well, look, definitionally, to be human is to suffer. We all suffer. The way I put it in the book is we all go through hell. You know, the hell of a child in trouble, the hell of losing a loved one, the hell of a lost reputation, the hell of anxiety, the hell of cancer, name it. Choose your hell. We all go through hell. I wrote this book with the hope that we wouldn't all come out of hell empty-handed, that we would make something of what that experience brought to us, not only what it took from us. And you know, Dean, in my experience, pain is the only real teacher. You know, success doesn't teach us very much other than to keep doing the same thing over and over again.
Right.
Or to think we're somehow special. Really, in my life, pain has been the great teacher. It is the great teacher. And so I think that's why the book has resonated so deeply with so many people, is we all intuitively know this. And we all feel and experience pain, and we don't want to come out of it empty-handed. We do want to learn something and make our lives, hence the title, more beautiful than before, despite our losses. So that's sort of the genesis of the book.
Well, I thought the book was marvelous, by the way, and
Thank you.
I teach a class on Sundays at my church, and this is a book that I'll be teaching out of if and when we ever start gathering together again. But you made a point, your very first point about this apology and saying that you didn't really know what you were talking about. By the way, any of us who have given parenting advice before we had children,
Yeah, right.
had to go back and do those same apologies, right?
Right.
So, but the point you were making, I thought was so interesting, is you wanted to make this apology and you wanted to kind of come clean, but that's so vulnerable. You are very vulnerable in this book, and that's not, I don't know, and it just seems like that's such a risky thing to do, is to be as vulnerable as you are and as you were in this book. You know, it's almost un-American. You know, we just kind of put this facade in front of us and say it's only a flesh wound, and yet the only reason I think it resonates as well as it does is that you were so vulnerable. So here's my writing question. Were you thinking when you were writing this, ooh, do I really want to put myself out there like this? Because that was risky.
Yes, and okay. Yes, and I know no other way.
Okay.
I do not know how to write anything that I want to read unless it's transparent and truthful. Now, I pulled a few punches in the book. I don't tell you the whole story.
Well, you made yourself look pretty brutal there during the opioid thing.
I told the truth, but you know, I'd be lying if I said it was the whole truth, because you know there's some discretion required,
sure.
and
there's privacy.
There are privacy issues, and rabbis. How can I put? I felt that by piercing the veil of the whole clergy persona was a very important example to set for what I'm essentially advocating in the book. You know, there's an essay in the book entitled "The Prisoner Cannot Free Himself." It's from a story in the Talmud, and I think it's such a profound idea. The prisoner cannot free himself. Now, this has two important sides to it. One, it means those of us who are suffering have to be willing to reach out. Right? No one suffers pain better alone. No one. And I was a go-it-alone guy. Very much so. Very much so. You know, vulnerability was weakness in my childhood.
Right.
And I talk a little bit about, you know, it's interesting. The book is only about 5% about my life, but it's always 90% of what these interviews are about, which really tells you how important it is. Right? So the first side of it is, those of us who are victimized by pain, we should not go it alone. We need to reach out. Now, the other side, the other truth of it is, we need to reach back to those who are reaching out, right? So it's for both ends of the spectrum. And, you know, I tried in the book also to deal with this notion that, you know, pain is both universal and very specific. And when you do reach out, people will understand because they have felt their own pain and suffering. The details, you know, are particular to you, but there's a universal truth to it all. And you will mostly be pleasantly surprised by the welcome.
And you were raised in a religious tradition, and I was raised in a religious tradition. And somehow we got the message that if you're really good, if you're a good person and you do all the right stuff, you pay your taxes and you recycle and
Yeah.
you floss, then you get a pass.
Right. Nothing bad will happen. Yeah.
Yeah. So where did that come from?
Well, it comes from sorry for saying this, but we're going to have a candid conversation here. We've already discussed the importance of candor in writing and communicating.
Right.
It comes from very bad theology, very bad clergy, and pediatric religious thinking.
Okay, you got to explain that. I love that term. I want to hear it.
Look, a 5-year-old, let me back up. When I was 5 years old, my brother Greg and I shared a bedroom. There were 7 of us in a 3-bedroom home, so Greg and I shared a bedroom. And I remember very distinctly there was this tall chest of drawers in the bedroom, and I would sit in front of it on a little stool, and I would play God with that chest of drawers. I would turn the dials to have a snow day so I didn't have to go to school.
I love it.
I'll pull out a drawer so it would rain candy. I was an omniscient, omnipotent God.
Yeah.
Why? Because that is as sophisticated a theology as a 5-year-old brain is capable of.
Yeah.
Right? An omnipotent God.
Yeah.
The problem is that most people go out into the adult world as they mature without ever re-examining the theology of their kindergarten year. It's a pediatric theology and it doesn't hold up, right? And
I love it.
There's a lot of very sophisticated theology that deals with what we call in my world theodicy, God and the problem of evil, right?
Yeah. Or that God causes this or causes that.
Right. It's not evil, it's punishment. I could walk you through, Theodicy 101, but it would take the rest of the time we have. But let me just say that even the book of Job, for example, which undoes so much of the bad theology that precedes it in the Bible, the first verse says, Job was a blameless man.
Right.
Right? It is the first book in the Bible that very clearly tells us, as Harold Kushner put it in what I think is a good book with a great title, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, that people suffer who don't deserve it. Okay?
Right.
And just as terrible as that, people are also rewarded who don't deserve it, right?
That's even worse.
That's even worse. So, it's very clear that cosmic justice and earthly justice are not the same thing, and we need to get engaged in this thinking at a deep level. So, look, one of the proudest, I'll just writer to writer, I'll just tell you, one of the proudest moments of my life as a writer was, all writers, I think, obsessively check Amazon when their new book comes out. And one of the proudest moments of my life was when I saw that my book was ranked right up there with Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning and Harold Kushner's When Bad Things Happen to Good People, because that's what I hoped it would be. I hoped that it would help people make peace with their suffering in a way that ennobled their life going forward.
Yeah, I definitely got a sense of both of those writers, and even Rabbi Abraham Heschel.
It's interesting you say that, Dean, because it's almost always one or two in front of or behind the Sabbath, and you're exactly right. You're exactly right. And for a guy who grew up cutting his teeth on those writers, it's an amazingly gratifying experience and humbling, and I don't think I deserve to be there. I don't think any of us who write, who find any daylight for their work, feels like we deserve it. But I am proud of it.
Sure. Well, one of the things, let me ask you from a writer's perspective. I think you have so many just really apt or poignant observations and interactions with people that I think when I teach writing workshops and things like that, I actually tell people, you have those same interactions and those same kinds of observations, you observe things, but the difference between you, Rabbi Leder, and everybody else is that you can pull out an event or a piece of a conversation or something that you read, and you can make this broader point. So what about the writers who are watching this or who will watch this later? Do you have advice for them on
I do.
how to keep track of these details that you make so good?
Well, first of all, you can use your own title for the game I'm about to tell you that I play all the time. And it's not easy to be playing this game all the time in my mind. But I am always playing this game in my head called What's the Sermon?
Oh, right.
I have to write a sermon every week.
Yeah.
And I do a column every week. And so I am always asking myself in almost any situation, interaction, etc., what's the sermon? What's the sermon?
Right.
Because here's the thing about being particular. The particular is the most universal of all things. Let's think about it in a scientific way for a moment. If you break a physical object down to its absolute tiniest components, to the molecular level, you are at one and the same time revealing what it has in common with all matter.
Right.
So the universal is no different than the particular. The particular is an example of a universal principle. So I'm always looking at the particular and asking myself, what is the universal? What is the sermon? What is the message? And I'll say one other thing to all the writers who are here. And this is the part that removes me from life a little bit and is not always so easy. And that is what Graham Greene said, the difference between a writer and everyone else is the writer has a sliver of ice in him that enables him to take notes. So when I'm in these very emotionally intense situations, the burying of a child, the suicide of a young parent, the loss of a public reputation, the wife who just found out her husband's cheating on her and she's weeping on the couch in my office. When I'm in the midst of these hyper intense experiences, I am present, but I am also, because of that sliver of ice in my soul, I'm also taking notes. Yeah, because there's a sermon in it, right? There's a sermon in it. And this is just my orientation to the world. Right.
So what you're describing is experiencing life at two levels.
Correct.
Being fully present in the pain and suffering of another person, but also paying attention so that you can say, there may be something in here that will be useful for somebody else. So let me put it in a category of somebody who doesn't have a sermon to preach every weekend. What if, I think for writers, especially beginning writers, would you say that maybe the thing that they could do would be to just assume that they're going to speak on this at some point and go ahead and write the column, write something every week or every day or whatever of what you observed, and at least just get it down. Do it as a blog post or whatever. What do you think?
I think that's right. I have a running list at all times. I'm old school. My running list is actually a legal pad on my desk. I don't use whatever note program is on my phone. Right. But I keep a running list. I also am blessed. I do not have a good memory for certain things, but I have a really freakish memory for stories and for moments. I just do. So, and your point about blogging, I think, is very important. Every single person who wants to write can publish now. Everyone. I'll tell you an interesting story that has to do with a very famous writer who I think everyone knows, and that's Aaron Sorkin, the great playwright and screenwriter Aaron Sorkin.
I was going to get to him in just a second, but I'm really glad you're talking about him now. We're going to get to him.
Okay, so I've known him for a long time. We don't see or speak with each other. We haven't for years. But when I was sort of beginning to think about my first book, which was, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago, we were pretty close and seeing each other regularly. And I remember saying to him once, well, when I'm a writer, and he looked at me and said, Steve, you are a writer. You give a sermon every week. You're a writer. What do you mean when I'm a writer? You already are a writer. That is now true of every single person on the planet with access to a computer. So to everyone here who's listening, who aspires to be published, you can be a writer long before you're published. You could just a blog post, an email to a friend. This is what happened today, and this is how it made me feel, and this is how it connected me to something larger and might connect you to something larger. Articulate these ideas and examples. And because I do have to produce content so regularly, I actually keep a running list of remember to talk about this, remember to talk about that, remember to, and I think, you know, I'm sure you've said this a million times in your classes, Dean, people who say they're going to write never do.
No, in fact, I put up on the on a whiteboard or a chalkboard or whatever is in the room. I always say the people who say they're going to write or they're, you know, when they have time.
Yeah, they never.
They aren't writers.
That's
so
right.
I take out the R and I put in the word A. I say they're waiters.
Right.
So it's only one letter difference.
That's right. Yeah.
So, but when you're talking about writing about particulars, I think one of the things that inhibits us from writing about something that we've seen or observed or whatever is we want to say something profound. You know, we want to make this huge cosmic point. And my guess is that you just write stuff down and either the point comes later or you can find a point in the process. Is that
my first book was called The Extraordinary Nature of Ordinary Things. So I actually believe these things that most people don't view as profound are incredibly profound. I just sent a piece out yesterday to my whole congregation. Every Friday afternoon, I send out a message. It's usually based on the weekly reading from the Bible, from the Torah. And it was in no small measure about my love for toasted rye bread with butter on it. Now, you might think, well, that's not a very profound thought. But then the piece unfolded into how important it is to focus on the beauty of what remains during a time when so much has been taken away. And the beauty of the simple and the quotidian, that it's easy to take for granted. And you know, I think that's a profound idea, right? The beauty of what remains is a very profound idea. And one that really helps people count their blessings, even in pandemic and social unrest, darkness, right? So I don't think there are, you know, it's funny, I'm just thinking about that quote. I don't remember who said it. There are no small parts, only small actors. I don't think there are any insignificant moments in life. I think we sometimes fail to see the significance in these things, but it's always there. And it's much more relatable for the reader and for ordinary humans than something with a lot of multisyllabic words in it.
Yeah. So just let's circle back to Aaron Sorkin just for a minute. Was
Sure.
Pretty much the peak of a point in your lifetime when there was a reference to one of your sermons in West Wing?
Well, it was even better than a reference. It was a third of the whole sermon. So Aaron called me one day and he said, I'm doing an episode of West Wing and it's about capital punishment. What does Judaism have to say about capital punishment? And I said, well, I've written a sermon on it. I'll send it to you. So I sent him the sermon and he called me up and he said, well, do you want a check or do you want a writer's credit or do you want both? Because this is going in. And of course, I was young and falsely humble at the time. So I said, I don't need a writer's credit. I'm happy to give it to you. I'm happy you have it, etc. That was stupid. I should have asked for it.
Yeah.
But in any case,
I hope you learned your lesson.
Yeah, I did. Anyway, that's how it happened. He just called and said, Steve, what is Judy? I get a lot of calls. It's sort of one of the cool things about being a rabbi in LA, I guess. I'm not alone in this. I get a lot of calls from people who are producing content for TV or film. And they often call and say, what does Judaism have to say about this? Or is this correct? Or, would this be how it's done? And mostly people try to be very responsible, and he was trying to be responsible. By the way, they also filmed that sermon on the pulpit in our sanctuary, which was also sort of cool. Yeah, it was great. It was great. It's amazing how many people.
I remember the episode.
By the way, that episode won the Humanitas Award. It was a very powerful episode called "Take This Sabbath Day."
Yeah, no, I remember the episode. It was very powerful.
It doesn't hurt that Aaron's a genius either.
Well, that's true. That's true. So let's talk about how you as a writer and as a rabbi. I know you can't really separate those two. You're looking at what we're facing as a nation and as a world today. And really, there are two things I'd like you to address. Especially from the perspective of suffering, I think, and the pandemic, clearly, or as one of my friends calls it, the pandemic. But that and this, finally, we're coming to this realization of the injustices that have been so built into our country. How are you addressing this from a writer and as a spiritual leader?
I'm writing a piece every week to share with the congregation during this. I just sent out yesterday my 15th. So I have sent out 15 weekly, what I would call essays, really, to help people frame and cope and even flourish under the circumstances of both the pandemic and the confronting of racism that was hiding in plain sight all along, right? So I've dealt with it on a weekly basis. Now I do that for a couple of reasons. I've just finished up the final draft, and it's been accepted, of my next book. So I'm doing a lot of other writing, and I really can't do more than a week, once a week. And also, I have found that I'm a rabbi who has no interest in being a pundit. I have no interest in reacting like a seismograph, to every bump out of Washington, D.C. or Seattle or Minneapolis or anywhere else. I don't want to spend my life doing that. There are plenty of other people who do that, and I don't consider that writing. That's being a pundit. So I do it once a week to manage the expectations of my congregation. Like, we're going to hear from the rabbi every Friday at 5:00. Okay, so I'm not going to be after him on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. What do you think about this? Why haven't you said something about that? And I found that's the best way for me to manage a very large congregation. By the way, also a politically diverse congregation, and also a way to manage my time. And also, frankly, I don't have that much to say that isn't already being said. I'm not interested in regurgitating what other people are saying. So, and I try to write in a way that includes the details of the week in some fashion, but is also something that I hope will hold up 200 years from now. In other words, as we were speaking about before, Dean, these weekly examples are really examples of much larger principles at work in Judaism, and in the human experience. So that's how I've tried to deal with it, is to create a weekly vessel for it. Now, I'm also doing a lot of teaching, which is different than writing, and that I'm doing more of.
So when you're addressing this, you aren't necessarily thinking about how can the nation heal. You're trying to say, I have a congregation that I'm responsible for. I need to give them something hopeful, something useful, some good news. When everything around me doesn't look like good news.
Correct.
So is that accurate?
Or sometimes to offer some empathy for how
Sure.
we're all feeling in the midst of the bad news.
Yeah. In fact, that was what I was leading up to, is that there's something valuable, I think, from a writer's perspective of just naming the lament. You know, whatever it is that is ailing you personally or ailing us as a state or as a city or as a nation, to just hang some language on it. I would even submit that there's something healing about that act. Would you agree?
I talk about this in the book. The most painful aspect of pain is the feeling of isolation and abandonment, that you are in it alone, that no one understands, that no one really cares, right? It's not so much the affliction itself as the feeling of isolation that results from it that is so terribly painful. This is why that metaphor of the prisoner cannot free himself is so powerful. It's a prison. You feel alone, cut off, isolated. And I think one of the gifts that writers can bring to others is the comfort of knowing they're not alone. Oh, my marriage is like that too. I guess I'm not the only one. It doesn't hurt so much. Oh, I'm worried about my laid off 30-year-old too. You know, oh, I'm worried about my retirement savings too. Oh, the rabbi is saying in a piece that he knows, he appears to know what he's doing to us, but he's just making it up as he goes along like we are. Oh, I think one piece I wrote many, many weeks ago that really resonated with people was where I started it with a conversation I was having with a friend and about the pandemic, and this was before George Floyd, and I said to my friend, I find the whole thing epic. It's incredibly invigorating. It's an incredible opportunity. And he said to me, well, yeah, but that's because you're a leader and you're a positive person. So of course you see it as an opportunity. And the piece started with that conversation, and then I flipped it and said, actually, I'm as worried as the next guy. I'm filled with anxiety about this. I just don't let it defeat me. And then people wrote in, I mean, just so many emails saying, that was so brave of you, because that's how I feel as a parent. That's how I feel as a boss with all these employees looking to me about whether or not they're going to have jobs. That's how I feel, as a teacher. And so I think that a big component of successful writing, the reason we read, is to know we're not so alone in our suffering or in the human experience. Why do we still read the Bible? I'll tell you why. Because they're simple stories about terribly dysfunctional people. And therefore, it's relevant.
Yeah. And you draw from Old Testament stories so well. So let's get to some of the questions that are being sent in from viewers, listeners, whatever. And in the last segment here, one of them had to do with your the book that you're finishing now. What's the status of that? When can we hope to see it? And give us the pitch of how it's going to change our
life.
So
the good news is I'm finally, and all of you watching and participating who have written books know what I mean. I am now at the fun part. Okay? The manuscript has been accepted. It's going to be published by Penguin Random House. It will be out on January 5th of 2021. They keep moving the date up. They're very happy with it. And the title has changed a little bit from what Marnie announced. The title is The Beauty of What Remains, How Our Greatest Fear Becomes Our Greatest Treasure. And it's a book about essentially what death comes to teach us about life, the value of life, the purpose of life, the way death gives life meaning and ennobles life with purpose and meaning. So it's that's the book. It's I have to tell you, I'm just going to brag for a second. It's not nice, but my editor, Caroline Sutton, who's a senior managing editor at Penguin Random House, she wrote back. I'll just tell you a funny story which writers can relate to. So I sent in the final, what I thought was my final draft. It was due on my birthday, June 3rd. And that was a Friday, and I'm waiting and waiting. And on Tuesday, I'm in a Zoom call very much like this, and I have my phone to my left. And my emails, when they come up on my phone, show me the first two lines. So the first two lines were, it said, from Caroline Sutton, and it said, "Dear Steve, I don't know what to say. This is not a manuscript." And I thought, oh my God, she's rejected.
I've lost it.
Yeah, she's going to reject the manuscript after my third rewrite. I thought the email was, "Dear Steve, I don't know what to say. This is not a manuscript. This is garbage. This is terrible.
Yeah.
This is right."
Yeah.
And I'm on this Zoom call. I can't read the email. I'm freaking out. The call finally ends. I grab my phone. It says, "Dear Steve, I don't know what to say. This is not a manuscript. This is a miracle."
Oh my.
Yeah. And she just went on and said, and it ended with every writer's favorite sentence, "There is nothing left for me to do." And then she wrote, "Wow." And it was
Just lay down for a while.
Honestly, Dean, I wept.
Yeah.
I went to find, first of all, I was weeping also because a lot of this book is about, again, an apology for the ways in which I was wrong about death until I experienced the death of my own father 18 months ago. And how much I didn't know until I had lived it. And the ways in which I'm still learning. So I wept because it was also a gift from my father. I wept because it was it was also a letting go of my father. I've been living with him in my head, writing this book for 18 months. And it was also like, you have to let go now, Steve. The book is done. You can't spend 6, 7, 8 hours a day thinking about your dad like that anymore. I was weeping because obviously the pressure was off. I have to say, other than my falling in love with my wife when she walked in the room when I first saw her, and the birth of my children, really, it was one of the greatest moments of my life. I have the letter here. It's framed. I framed the email. It was, I really, now, will the book be popular? I don't know. But I had that moment. And I deeply respect the woman who wrote that email. She's tough, really tough.
Yeah.
So I feel great.
I think framing the email is such a writer thing to do. So way to go.
Look, yeah, there it is.
Oh man, I love it. Congratulations. But talking about death and dying, on the one hand, it's such buzzkill. I mean, I can just see you at some cocktail party and somebody saying, "What's your next book about?" And you say death and dying, and they're kind of moving on to somebody who wants to talk about hedge funds. But go ahead.
Look, let me just, since this is sort of an inner meeting for writers here in a lot of ways. My subtitle for the book was "The Beauty of What Remains, What Death Teaches Us About Life." And Penguin Random House refused to put death in the subtitle. I think they were unduly influenced by the pandemic and by being New York centric, where it was so terrible, right? So we had to somehow try to get people to see it's a book about death without it being about death. And I don't like the subtitle, but I don't have ultimate control over the subtitle. They do. And we duked it out, and Caroline said, "Look, Steve, our marketing people, our PR people, we love this subtitle. That's going to be it." So, okay. but when you give me a more than the subtitle, and I can say to people, it's really a book about what death teaches us about life. Everyone goes like this. Oh, wow. And that's why I think it's going to be okay. And the other thing is, for better or for worse, I'm not interested in writing about much else. I'm interested in the human condition. I'm not interested in, writing about baseball or fly fishing or a diet book or whatever the hell, sells. So, and I had to address the cognitive dissonance of my relationship with my father. And, in a way, Dean, I think much of what we've talked about today is about cognitive dissonance. The rabbi, the human being, the writer, the person living an experience, the leader who's also an anxious follower. So much of, I think, what makes writing interesting to read is about cognitive dissonance, is about the dichotomous tension between irreconcilable differences that somehow nevertheless have to be reconciled. And that's the energy that I'm interested in exploring in my books. I can't speak for others.
Yeah. The tension is where the action is, and that it's not, very few people are going to really resonate with a book where everything just goes swimmingly well and, and Steve saves the circus or something like that.
Right.
How do I deal with this tension?
Right.
So let me circle back to the vulnerability question. There's a question in here from one of our viewers that says, how vulnerable should I be in my writing? I'm afraid to reveal too much. I think that's a $1 million question, because do I want to really expose all of this? You probably, well, when you said you dialed some of your stuff back, and even the stuff that you're talking about with your father, how vulnerable do you really want to be, and how do you know when you're being too vulnerable?
Well, look, first of all, I think there are some clear lines you don't want to cross. One of them is you don't want to embarrass the people you love without permission. So if I'm going to write about my wife or my kids, I ask them, I want to talk about, the day you cut your finger off, is that okay? Whatever it might be, I want to talk about your learning disability. I want to talk about, your horrible relationship with your mother. Is that okay? So I think that's one place where you could, when it involves another person's story, not just your own, then I think you need to ask, and you will have some boundaries, and you'll know how far can I go and where do I need to stop. When it comes to your own life, and it's not going to embarrass anyone else, I think you need to go as far as necessary to make your point. And once you've made your point, I think then that's far enough. Like, in other words, don't be gratuitous, right? Because the reader can smell a gratuitous example. The reader can smell, I think, a drama queen or drama king who's writing. Right? I think the reader can sniff that out. So you need to be very precise. Like, is this detail I'm about to reveal meaningful to the reader's experience, or is it simply gratuitous? Chekhov said about writing a short story, never describe the gun over the mantelpiece if it isn't going to go off, right? So if these personal vignettes aren't going to go off in that sense, aren't absolutely perfectly aimed, then you don't need it. But if it is the perfect way to sting the reader into feeling what you are feeling, then I think you got to use it. And it's a little like Potter Stewart, Dean. When Justice Potter Stewart was asked to define obscenity for the Supreme Court, he said, I can't define it, but I know when I see it. And I think most writers, I'll tell you one other thing.
Yeah.
I have my wife who does this for me. We all need someone to show it to who says, you can't say that. You can't say that. I mean, my wife, many times I'll show her something, she'll come back in and say, you can't say that. You cannot say that. And then I take it out.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, one of my books that I wrote called God Hides in Plain Sight.
Yeah.
I had my kid, because I told a bunch of anecdotes about my kids and about my wife, and I had them all read it ahead of time. My son called me and said, why is it that every one of the anecdotes you tell about me, I end up crying? And I thought, okay, that's a fair comment. That's a really, really fair comment. And so I dialed those
Yeah, and sometimes we don't even realize, like one of the notes from my editor on the early version of the manuscript for the next book was, where's your mother in all of this? Where is she? And you know, I dealt with that in the epilogue. I said, my mother is not in this book, and that's because my father claimed me as his at a very young age. And then I went into that claim my father made on my life at a young age. But I definitely think you need a third party, and you know, these are the ways. Yeah. But I do believe that we know our own story, and that's really the only story we can tell.
Well, it's really the only thing in life that we own.
That's right.
You may think you own your house and your car, but really the only thing you own is your story.
I think a journalist tells other people's stories. Yeah, go ahead. Go. You go ahead, please.
Well, that's true. Yeah. No, that's a good point. The gratuitous nature, I have read a number of memoirs where I just feel like this person is just doing therapy on himself or on herself. And
in front of me. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's not how I feel about your stuff, by the way.
Yeah. Well, listen, I have a certain advantage that most writers don't, which is a 2,500 word sermon every freaking week, okay, for decades. And I have learned, because I perform my writing live, to put it bluntly, okay? The books came after many years of preaching. So I've learned what people can let in and what they shut out. I have an audience reaction to judge my writing by. So I've gotten pretty good because of that, of knowing where the sensitivities are in most people. I have also learned to write to be heard, not to be read. And I think it's one of the things, and I haven't changed that style in order to be read. And I think it's one of the things, I'm not saying better or worse, I'm saying different. I think it's one of the things that makes my writing different. Not better, not worse, but different than most writers is I am mostly schooled in writing to be heard, not read. So you won't find these long Proustian, run-on sentences. You're gonna read short, stubby, simple, but hopefully not simplistic articulations and portraits, in my writing. And I think it's been a distinct advantage to have had all those years speaking in front of all those people.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. So unfortunately, you and I, at least I feel like I could yak with you.
I'm with you.
And but I'm running out of time here. So let me just ask the advice question. A lot of people who are just getting started, they want to know, how do I do this? Not how do I be the next Steve Leder, but how do I become a writer? Do you have some advice for them?
Yeah, say yes to everything.
I love that advice.
I started out writing sermons because I had to, and then one went pretty well, and I thought, I'm gonna send this one in to the Jewish Journal, okay, just a small local newspaper, and see if they'll publish it. And guess what? They took it. And then I pitched them other ideas. And then they came back to me and said, would you do this column every week?
Wow.
And I said, yes. And I used to write it. My day off was Thursday. I used to spend my entire day off working on this, 700-word column. Then I would drive to Kinko's and fax it to the editor, and wait for the notes to come back. And I just said yes to every opportunity. Say yes, just say yes. I don't care if it's your church or synagogue newsletter or your PTA newsletter or your Cub Scout troop newsletter, or I don't care what it is. Anybody that will print something you will write, say yes, and just get started and just keep going. Because if you have the talent, it will be recognized and more opportunities will unfold. It's like digging ditches, one shovelful at a time. That's it.
I love it. I love it. That's actually terrific advice. So, sir, one of these days I'll come up, we'll hang out.
Okay, very good. We're fellow Minnesotans. Thank you, Dean. You're a pleasure to talk with. You really are.
Well, it's I feel very similarly. And Marnie, you introduced me to somebody here who's just amazing. So
Marnie, Marnie, when you were introducing me, I thought to myself, there's a piece in the new book, the theme of which is a little is a lot. And just those few interactions all those years ago at that little camp, to know that had a profound echo effect in your life. I can't even put into words what that means. I'm very proud of that, and I'm very grateful to you for connecting me to this group of such fine people. It really matters.
Thank you so much.
Wow. Hope you come back next year. This next book sounds amazing. And
I just said I say yes to everything, so I'll be back.
And I heard you say that this book was sort of an apology, and I just, what came to mind was, how innately you knew what to say, and you were 26, and just the right thing at the right moment. So you've had this nugget of this gift. Of course, it's been polished, but it's always been there,
No, thank you. Yeah, I don't think I was doing a bad job before, but it was an incomplete kind of truth. And there's this old Yiddish expression, a half-truth is a whole lie. So I knew after my own painful experience that I hadn't gotten it exactly right. And I hope, listen, this next book, I knew after my father's death that I hadn't gotten it exactly right. And I hope that this will set the record straight and help people feel understood. That's the mission.
This conversation, we've received so many comments. We're all crying behind the scenes, and the comments are just flooding in.
Love. Yeah.
How much you're speaking to what we need at this moment. So thank you, Dean. And thank you, Rabbi Leder. Continued friendship to all you guys.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you. I'm very proud of this. It's on the shelf in my study, and
it was an honor.
I'm super proud of it. I really am.
Yay.
And I spent some of my best childhood days in Coronado, so I have a real connection to the place.
Yeah.
I really do. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. That was incredible. And I hope you'll stick around. Thank you, Dean. Wonderful.
My pleasure.
Both will.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. All right, we'll talk to you soon.